All right, welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Casual Cafe. Today we are doing a research discussion, presenting you with practical applications of the history blueprint. We'll be presenting the use case. A useful research article happens to come across your desk, and this is something you could do with it beyond just looking at it or having a whole list of bookmarks or putting in Evernote. This would not only help you remember it, but in a future conversation when you want to refer to it with a friend, it's easy to recall where you stored it because it's in the brain. With me today is Kevin Cole, well known to those of you here in the research community, and also Andy Edwards, who you might have bumped into in a blog post or a chat box. But now he will be on here verbally reading through a Peter Dale Scott article that we'd all found interesting in our own way individually, but upon a little chat discussion, it found itself to be relevant and useful to capture a conversation where we would actually make that into something more than just an article. We would memorialize it within the history blueprint and share the screen capture with you of how we actually do that, or how I do that, while Kevin and Andy discuss the article. Gentlemen, welcome to this endeavor.
Thanks, Rich.
Good to be here.
All right. So the first thing I have to do is say Peter. Oh, it's not. He's not Russian. It's Peter Dale Scott. He's right there. And the article is titled "The Dulles Brothers, Harry Dexter White, Alger Hiss, and the Fate of the Private Pre-War International Banking System." Quite a mouthful. I'm going to click that open. That brings it up in my Firefox browser. And I'm going to go back to the brain. So what we're going to do is everything that's connected to this article, we're going to put off to the left side here. So when you come across an article in the history blueprint, you're going to see the article under its author, and then all the topics that article touches on, and then each one of these are also connected into the history blueprint at its different areas. So Andy, if you want to go ahead and start off with the title and author of the piece in its formal fashion, and then just peruse into the first paragraph. If Kevin has something to add in, to interject that Mr. Dale Scott is not mentioning, he'll do that at some point. And if I need to stop you to explain what I'm doing for the audience, I'll do so. But until then, I'll just kind of quietly click through here and do it spontaneously, like I would if we weren't on a call.
Okay, so this is out of the Asia Pacific Journal, Japan Focus, and again, the title is "The Dulles Brothers, Harry Dexter White, Alger Hiss, and the Fate of the Private Pre-War International Banking System." And starts out, the election of Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1952 had permanent consequences for U.S. foreign policy. I'm going to stop right here and just let you know that if you hear a bunch of whining, it's my dog, and he's on the floor, and he's pretty weirded out with Skype. So with that out of the way, I'll pick back up again here. The election of Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1952 had permanent consequences for U.S. foreign policy. The U.S. major oil companies, which before the election were facing criminal charges for their cartel arrangements, instead were free to continue their activities until, quote, in some of the faraway countries where it did business. Exxon's sway over local politics and security was greater than that of the United States Embassy, end quote. Parallel to this was the radical escalation in 1953 of CIA covert operations, major plots to overthrow the governments of Iran, Guatemala, both of which had been turned down by Truman and his Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, now proceeded, redefining America's relationship to the Third World. The key to this important change was not Eisenhower, but the Dulles brothers, formerly both partners in the firm Sullivan and Cromwell, which for years had represented the oil cartel. And then goes into a little quote, as long as his brother, John Foster Dulles, was Secretary of State, Allen Dulles, CIA director, had no need to chafe under political control. An adventurous director whose brother held the second highest office in the administration, was able to act almost at will, as he was shielded from any unpleasant consequences. The 1952 Republican campaign, for which John Foster Dulles was partly responsible, successfully attacked Truman's supposed weakness in dealing with the alleged treason of two of his civil servants, Treasury Assistant Secretary Harry Dexter White and State Department official Alger Hiss. In fact, Neither White nor Hiss was ever convicted of treason, nor were they ever proven to have committed it, but both men's careers had been ruined by the sensational charges brought against them in 1948 by a freshman congressman, Richard Nixon, in the House Un-American Activities Committee. And he goes into an overview of this essay. It has long been known that Nixon, in his interrogation of White and Hiss, was being fed information by FBI agents acting with the approval of J. Edgar Hoover. This essay will argue that Nixon also received assistance from the Dulles brothers, especially in a key meeting between the three men on August 11, 1948, 5 days before White's untimely and disputed death. At stake in the meeting was the Republican campaign in 1948, the first campaign ultimately unsuccessful, in which, quote, the GOP dubbed the Democrats the party of treason, end quote. But deeper issues were also at stake. As we shall see, Harry Dexter White, backed by Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, had his own candidates for treasonable behavior. Above all, Allen Dulles' friend and former OSS agent Thomas McKittrick, the American wartime president of the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland. You want to go, Kev?
Sure. Yeah. At this point, just to introduce a little bit of to introduce the Bank of International Settlements a little bit. This is something that Carol Quigley talked about a lot on page 310 of Tragedy and Hope: The History of the World in Our Time. Now, to understand it, you want to go back and read the earlier chapter where he goes into the Dawes Plan and the Young Plan, who is Owen Young of the General Motors Corporation, who's also the chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations, as well as many other key positions in the Anglo-American establishment. But picking up on the Bank of International Settlements, he says on 310, he says this deal was embodied in the Young Plan, named after American Owen D. Young, who is a J.P. Morgan agent, who served as chairman of the committee which drew up the new agreements from February to June of 1929. 20 governments signed these agreements from January 1930. The agreement with Germany provided for reparations to be paid for 59 years at rates rising from 1.7 billion marks in 1931 to a peak of 2.4 billion marks in 1966, and then declining to less than a billion marks in 1988. The earmarked sources of funds of Germany were abolished except for 660 million marks a year, which could be commercialized, and all under the protection of Germany's foreign exchange position that ended by the placing of responsibility for transferring reparations from marks for foreign currency squarely on Germany. To assist in this task, a new private bank called the Bank of International Settlements was established in Basel, Switzerland, owned by the chief central banks of the world and holding accounts for each of them. The Bank of International Settlements was to serve as a central banker's bank and allow international payments to be made by merely shifting credits from one country's account to another on the books of the bank.
The BIS had handled Nazi-looted gold when other banks had refused to do so. And at the war's end, McKittrick was, quote, arranging deals with Nazi industrialists to guarantee their profits after the war was over, end quote. In contrast, the Morgenthau-White plan for post-war Germany called for the country to be deindustrialized and the power of the German cartels to be broken. The pre-war banking system linking American bankers to those who had backed Hitler was also to be demolished. The meeting of allies at Bretton Woods in July 1944, organized largely by White, had passed a resolution calling for the dissolution of the BIS, quote, at the earliest possible moment. A version of the Morgenthau-White plan was approved by Truman in May 1945 at JCS, that's Joint Chiefs of Staff 1067, which directed U.S. forces of occupation in Germany to take, quote, no steps looking toward the economic rehabilitation of Germany. But both McKittrick and Allen Dulles had a quite antithetical vision for Germany, that its economy should indeed be rehabilitated, and eventually made the underpinning for a more united Western Europe. Thus, quote, Dulles and others began to campaign against JCS 1067, end quote, and for its replacement by what later came to be known as the Marshall Plan. On one level, this was a conflict between powerful individuals. White in Washington, Morgenthau soon retired, versus the banker McKittrick and the lawyer Allen Dulles, both of whom returned after World War II to Wall Street. But it was also an institutional conflict between Washington and Wall Street because each center was initially united behind conflicting visions for the future of Germany and also for the future of the pre-war international banking system uniting Germany and America, at the heart of which was the BIS. Another way to say this is that it was a contest between the conflicting visions of the state, Washington on the one hand, and the deep state, Wall Street on the other. In this contest, as in many others at this time, Washington lost and Wall Street won. The Dulles brothers and their allies, who argued that Germany must be rebuilt as rapidly as possible as a bulwark against the Soviet Union, triumphed over Morgenthau and White. The BIS returned the looted Nazi gold, and the calls for its dissolution faded away. There were various reasons for Wall Street's victory. Prominent among these were the death of Roosevelt and his replacement by Truman with his conservative Secretary of State James Burns. Perhaps even more important was the brutish behavior of Stalin in Eastern Europe and the revelation, thanks to the 1946 defection of a Soviet code clerk in Ottawa, that Moscow had a robust network of spies in the West. These and other factors made Washington agree to the replacement of JCS 1067 by the Marshall Plan, which perhaps would have been better called the Dulles Plan. But there were deeper aspects to the conflict. The Dulles brothers were determined to destroy not just a plan for Germany, which they disliked, but the Democratic New Deal, by which the party under first Roosevelt and then Truman had restricted the traditional freedoms of Wall Street and were now threatening to break up the oil cartel. Here, the Republicans had their eyes on Harry Dexter White in particular. The reason then given for this, and still believed by some intelligent people, was that White was a spy. But as we shall see, there were also those who believed that the evidence for this is very debatable. We shall consider the suggestion of Anthony Summers and others that Allen Dulles and the CIA, as early as 1948, were the source of the furor over alleged treason of first White, and then after White's death in August 1948, a far less prominent substitute figure in Alger Hiss. Summers suggests that Allen Dulles, even while still a Wall Street lawyer, may have had access to a secret weapon not available to a mere Treasury assistant secretary like White, the Venona record of deciphered Soviet communications.
Yeah, Rich, do you want to give us a little bit of background on the Venona project?
I can do that. Let me just make this full screen here. All right. So as we're going through this article, we bump into a bunch of stuff that's in the brain, and the audience just saw me add McKittrick, who is absent from Wikipedia, so I included this other document that leads to his papers. So the important thing is, in order to understand the article that Peter Dale Scott is laying out, he's saying, I've read a tremendous amount and I'm trying to reflect what I've learned, but he also needs the audience to step up and say, okay, there's going to be names in here I'm not familiar with. I need to be an adult and responsible, and this is my line of thinking for myself. And so I'm just sharing visually what I do. If I was listening to an audio podcast and these guys were reading the article, this is what I would be doing. So I memorialize that information, I don't lose it, and then I have it easily referable in the future. That article pertains to all these different things. It's a really solid article. You don't come across these 10 times a week. That you might come across a solid article like that worth memorializing once a month, and this is the type of activity that I have to go through when I do that. The Venona project I came across when I was interested in this British conquest to recolonize America, and specifically the 20th century aspect of infiltrating our intelligence community. And I started noticing that once I got to the Soviet spies in the Cold War, that all these spies basically had Anglo-American handlers, Rhodes Scholar handlers, and that while the spies were persecuted and they get chased around the world, these other guys who were basically protecting them, there's a whole bunch of different terminology you come across, but dangles, people that say that they defect for purposes of coming in and getting information and this sort of thing. Well, you can look at James Jesus Angleton as a character like that because he was educated in Britain and spoke with a British accent early in his life. So the whole time that he's hunting the mole that they can't find, the British were using the Soviets as a proxy to penetrate our intelligence without jeopardizing the special relationship. But you can't really understand these things for yourself until you model them out. In my opinion, this is what I did for myself. So what you see on screen is the Venona spy detection project that was run between GCHQ and the NSA, and they basically recorded all these calls of these spies, but they didn't decrypt them till later. So they had the evidence, but it was, oh darn it, it was too late. These guys already did their damage. And then I modeled out all the different various, the Cambridge Five, all these different Cold War espionage, double, triple agent rings, and then I'd already discovered the double cross system, or the double cross network, or the 20 committee, or the X2 committee, or what do you want to call it in Britain, that was running all these double and triple agents, not only in the Soviet Union, but also in the United States and a whole bunch of other places around the world. So the Venona project is a great example of classic espionage study of how we got into the problems that led us into 9/11 in this country, the problems of the special relationship and Rhodes Scholars and other people trying to infuse organic unity. And so that was something that I picked up on. I've known about it for years, but only recently took the time to be like, okay, what do I really know about it? And that's what you find out when you try to put something like that into the model, because inadvertently, through adding all the parts that you're adding in there that are part of the understanding, you come across aspects that are lesser known to you, and you get a greater understanding of detail when you do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Venona project was something that was off my radar until probably a couple months ago, when just having a conversation with Rich, he introduced me to some of the transcripts and things that they might show that Joseph McCarthy may have been closer on the right track than people give him credit for. Now, I think what Quigley says in that the roundtable group was not afraid to work with the communists seems to be what bears out true in the end. Is that it wasn't that there was only there was a communist under every rock, and that we needed to deal with this Red Scare. It was that there was this international banking cartel that was not afraid to work with the communists if it helped to achieve their aims. And so you mentioned the Cambridge Five, and these are things connected to. These are topics talked about by Carol Quigley in Tragedy and Hope.
Well, they're also topics from Peace Revolution '83. Harold Philby, he's called Kim Philby. That's his nickname. His father, St. John Philby, was also a double agent who was alienated from the empire and yet, fully delivered. And, so they have a history of creating these people that are dangled out there to other cultures for purposes of assimilation, to figure out and can eventually control. And that's the story of the Saudi royal family and, the United States relationship with oil.
Mm-hmm. So it turns out a lot of the people that McCarthy, had his eye on as possible communist may have actually been communist. But then there's this whole other group with the Dulles brothers and those that are protecting the Bank of England and German banking interest and the money that was going to be tied up in the Bank of International Settlements should these other guys succeed in getting those funds locked up. There was a lot of interest in freeing that up and opening up a larger world system. So like where the Bank of International Settlements appears to fail, it's really used as a springboard for like the IMF and the World Bank and things to come later on.
Yeah. So Andy, go ahead and continue to.
Okay.
We can skip to the bottom of Bretton Woods to go back to who was guilty of treason, McKittrick or White, because this is where it starts to get more interesting.
Okay. The plans of White and other New Dealers for post-war Germany and the BIS had thus been decisively defeated by 1948. Only in the Clinton era, more than a half a century later, did some Americans' distrust of the BIS and McKittrick become known. At a minimum, McKittrick was suspected by Allied authorities of helping Axis countries acquire funds the U.S. government had tried to freeze. He maintained that the BIS was neutral and that no looted gold was held by the BIS. The U.S. Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner of the Central Intelligence Agency, had found evidence that McKittrick had collaborated with the Nazis. A report given to President Bill Clinton alleged that the Axis powers had virtually taken over the BIS. John Loftus and Marcus Ahrens go much further, accusing Allen Dulles and McKittrick together of having conspired to move Nazi-looted gold in the post-war era to Argentina. A more cautious account is given by James Calvin Baker, implicating the BIS under McKittrick's wartime tenure, but not Dulles. After the war, McKittrick was appointed to a high-level position at Chase Manhattan Bank. And for nearly 50 years, the operations involving the BIS and Swiss banks and looted assets by the Nazis were hidden in classified documents. The U.S. Treasury Department under White tracked Nazi gold as it moved in and out of the BIS. Several of these transactions were found to have occurred between the BIS and major Swiss banks. From these Swiss banks, money was used by the Nazis to purchase war material or was wired to accounts in Spain, Argentina, and the Middle East. But Wall Street rallied to protect McKittrick, offering him positions at first the Chase National Bank and then at the invitation of Averell Harriman to administer what became the Marshall Plan. Harriman also appointed an advisory committee consisting of Owen Young, a principal author of the pre-war German debt arrangements, and, quote, and of course Allen Dulles, who saw the Marshall Plan as the means of dealing the death blow to the spread of communism in Western Europe, end quote. One of the things that saved McKittrick and the BIS was the spy scare in the 1940s, which rightly or wrongly implicated White. Undoubtedly, real spies were discovered, some of them thanks to deciphered Venona intercepts, but others were the victims of hysteria. Was White one of these victims? White died before he could be indicted, and the charges against him are still disputed in America. Undoubtedly, White shared information with officials of the Soviet Union, which was then an ally, but the weight of evidence is that he was neither a Communist Party member nor securely under Soviet control. Chambers himself said of White, quote, his motives always baffled me, end quote. What is certain is that Venona transcripts were used to persuade U.S. officials that White was a Soviet spy, ending his career. It is clear, too, that hysteria also played a role. John Loftus and Mark Ahrens claim that the Dulles brothers helped foment this hysteria, and Richard Nixon, quote, became Allen Dulles' mouthpiece in Congress, end quote. Anthony Summers charges, in addition, that Nixon was fed secrets by the CIA as early as 1948, before Allen Dulles joined the organization he had helped create.
Okay, so we skipped over part of the Venona part of this article because it's a really long article, and I just want to show the general tendencies of when I'm taking in information from an article, how I associate it in the brain, and so the audience can pick up a lot from what's being looked at on the screen right now. Kevin, you probably have some things to say about Venona as far as, you know, how it ties in to the bigger picture, and maybe it will save time and add additional perspective for people who want to go back and read that part of the article.
Sure. I'll just read a little bit from that part of the article, and then I'll follow it up and with the quote that I have regarding the Schroeder connection, because the Schroeder bank connection and the attempts to save the money that they had invested in protecting Nazi Germany and protecting Germany after the First War, those are all very important pieces of background. In the article, it says, many on the left have referred to the post-war persecutions of Alger Hiss and the Rosenbergs as show trials, alleging that their underlying purpose was not to determine guilt or innocence, but to influence public opinion by publicizing guilt already determined, as a warning against dissent. But the spy scare of the 1940s was at least partly genuine, based largely on evidence from newly translated Venona transcripts from the records of the Soviet transmissions. It is certain that the Venona intercepts helped identify and convict spies such as Judith Copeland, even though for security reasons these intercepts were not introduced at the trials. Venona evidence was also used to raise suspicions about other suspects, including the previously mentioned Harry Dexter White and Alger Hiss. However, the Venona evidence against these two men is still fiercely debated today, and the campaign against both men was not powered by security concerns alone. In part, at least, it was a byproduct of a deeper conflict over the future of America between Wall Street, represented by the Dulles brothers, and remnants of the New Deal, represented by White, a principal architect of the International Monetary Fund and World Bank. The Dulles brothers, as lawyers at Sullivan and Cromwell, had played key roles in the interwar Western financing and refinancing of the German debt. A primary bank in these transactions was the British merchant bank J. Henry Schroeder and its American subsidiary, the J. Henry Schroeder Banking Corporation, where Allen Dulles as director and his brother as attorney were involved. A web of international banking connections was created between the wars, and much of this web was connected to the Bank of International Settlements via the Dulles brothers and their friends on Wall Street and in London and in Germany. So, as it was mentioned earlier, this Bank of International Settlements, it was kind of a way to force voluntary association amongst the Bank of England, the banking interest in the United States, and in Germany. And therefore, when this was about to fall, everybody's kind of freaking out that all of their assets are going to get caught up in this seizure. So in order to introduce a little bit more about John Foster Dulles and Sullivan Cromwell in the Schroeder connection, I'm going to read a small quote, small passage here from Building the Kingdom of God on Earth, the Church's Contribution to Marshall Public Support for World Order and Peace, 1919 to 1945, by an author and researcher by the name of Martin Erdman. This is the Schroeder connection on page 92. In the late 1920s, John Foster Dulles, who had by then become a senior partner at Sullivan and Cromwell, was appointed chief legal advisor to Schroeder Investment Bank, also known as Schrobanco. Sullivan and Cromwell and Schrobanco were both located in the same building owned by the Bank of New York at the corner of Wall Street and William Street. Allen W. Dulles, John Foster's brother and partner at Sullivan and Cromwell, became a director of the Schroeder Bank in New York and was retained as its legal counsel from 1938 to 1942. He was also an old friend with Frank C. Tiarks, a partner in the Schroeder Bank in London since 1902. In 1936, the Rockefellers selected Schrobanco to forge a link between the financial establishment of America and Nazi Germany. For this purpose, they formed a new investment bank, Schroeder, Rockefeller and Company Incorporated, also known as Schro-Rock, at 48 Wall Street, which would handle the underwriting and general securities business of J. Schroeder Banking Corporation and the Rockefeller interest at the same time. Avery Rockefeller, son of Percy Rockefeller, who had previously worked behind the scenes at Schrobanco, became the director and vice president of the new bank. Carlton Fuller, another bank at Schroeder's, was appointed president. John and Allen Dulles were chosen as the new company's lawyers. Now, this is where it gets really important, because in 1938, Frank C. Tiarks, managing director at J. Henry Schroeder and Company in London and a director of the Bank of England in 1912 to 1946, acted as Hitler's financial representative in Great Britain. After the First World War, Tiarks had worked closely with the German banking establishment. At the request of Lord Alfred Milner, who occupied an important post at the War Office at the time, he agreed to serve as the financial advisor to the British Army of Occupation in Germany, with the title of Civil Commissioner. Roberts notes that this was a role for which Tiarks was uniquely qualified by virtue of his membership of the Court of the Bank of England and his strong business and personal ties to Germany. For instance, Tiarks became particularly involved in the business affairs of three private banks in Cologne, notably J.H. Stein, the family firm of Baron Bruno's wife, Deichmann and Company, and Sal Oppenheim and Company. So what we're seeing here is that Lord Alfred Milner, the director of the Rhodes Trust and the heir apparent of Cecil Rhodes, is also involved in appointing the very directors of the Schroeder Bank to manage the British Army occupation force in Germany. Very important connection because, of course, Alfred Milner is the executor of the Rhodes Trust, who then develops the Milner Kindergarten that was busy in the Boer War and the Jameson raid in South Africa. And then Lionel Curtis and Abe Bailey, those that were part of this same group, go on to found the Royal Institute of International Affairs and the Council on Foreign Relations leading up to this point. Just wanted to get that in there because I think this really shows a continuity across all of the research that we've been doing and brings it together with Peter Dale Scott's article, even though he doesn't mention the connection to Lord Alfred Milner.
That's the type of value I expect, Kevin. Good job. All right, so let me just go back to, it's easier to go back here, probably. Back. Nope, not helping me out. Let me go back a few pages here in the blueprint. There it is. Got back to the article, go back to share that. All right, so let's jump down to this section of the article where Nixon and Dulles brothers, August 11th, 1948, and Harry Dexter White, because this starts to bring in Dylan Reed and HUAC and these types of things, and this is all a study of the Cold War spies. And so between mixing the reading of the article and the reading of the what's in the blueprint is really the grammar. These are all points of grammar, and the logic is reading all those pages, finding the primary sources, and finding a non-contradictory story between comparison of all these, different inputs to be processed, right? What you're seeing today, or what you're seeing today on screen and hearing us talk about, is really just step one. Collect the individual parts here that are in this article. So the article is your observation. The individual parts are here connected to the article. And then to understand this article, you have to understand all these different pieces of grammar that we've listed so far at a very minimum to understand the relevance of these people funding the Nazis and creating the IMF and creating the World Bank and creating the Bank for International Settlements and Cecil Rhodes' plan and all of this. It's not like these aren't despondent points that aren't talking to each other. These points all do have a connection. I'm not saying it's a conspiracy. I'm just saying observing that which exists is history, and we don't have to have like personal opinions about it. We just want to understand what is the landscape of that which exists and how does it connect together. And that's what we are attempting to do both auditorially and visually in this little research session, informal research session, unpracticed, unscripted, like we're just, going through like we would in our normal daily lives. This is what we do. We're just sharing a bit of it. Kevin, do you want to read that section on Nixon and Dulles? And, or, however you guys want to, toss back. I didn't want to put more work on Andy. It's his first call. I didn't want to discourage him from participating in the future.
Oh, no. Go ahead, Ted.
So, Andy,
are you at... Andy, the only thing is when Kevin's like reading or doing something like that, when you're not talking, in other words, just mute your Skype. And then Kevin, I'm thinking he's doing the same, and that's what I've been doing so that you don't hear my clicking in the background and whatnot.
Okay, are we at Nixon and Dulles Brothers, August 11th, 1948, and Harry Dexter White?
Affirmative.
Okay. Most accounts of Nixon's career point to an important meeting between Nixon and John Foster Dulles at the latter's Republican Party headquarters at the Roosevelt Hotel on August 11, 1948, a meeting also attended by Allen Dulles and Douglas Dillon of Dillon Reed, one of the banking firms that had financed Hitler. The conventional account is that Nixon approached the Dulleses with the conventional account is that Nixon approached the Dulleses with the proceedings from the House of Un-American Activities Committee, the HUAC, on which he sat. Virtually all accounts say that their discussion concerned Alger Hiss. It is probable, however, that when Nixon met with the Dulles brothers on August 11, 1948, the most urgent matter discussed was not Hiss, but the man principally targeted by HUAC's investigation, Harry Dexter White. White had been the focus of the HUAC attention in 1948, both when Elizabeth Bentley had testified on July 31st and Whittaker Chambers on August 3rd. White and Lachlan Curry, Bentley's two principal targets, together with William Donoman's law partner Duncan Lee, were due to testify in reply on August 13th, 2 days after the Dulles-Nixon meeting, along with Alger Hiss's brother Donald. All three men would deny Bentley's charges in their entirety, including the charge that was corroborated by Chambers that White had placed communists in government posts to influence policy. Chambers, of course, would be vindicated by Hiss's ultimate conviction twice on perjury charges. But the main importance of the Hiss at the Dulles-Nixon meeting in 1948 was the challenge to the credibility of Whittaker Chambers, a witness that had thus far had been a more important target than White himself. One of these two men, either Hiss or Chambers, was apparently guilty of perjury, and Truman's Justice Department was in the process of preparing a perjury indictment against Chambers, a key witness against White. Matters would change 5 days later on August 16, 3 days after the stressful HUAC testimony. White died after suffering 2 swift heart attacks. It was then that Hiss became, by default, HUAC's principal target and the key to Thomas Dewey's presidential ambitions the same year. He said, Scott goes on to say that he mentions this because of the suggestion by many authors in post-war Washington, either that White had to be discredited or a number of those involved in the Wall Street Berlin financial axis, including not just Thomas McKittrick, who was in charge of the Bank of International Settlements, but also possibly Prescott Bush, and perhaps even Bush's lawyer, Allen Dulles, risked being indicted. As Glenn Yeadon and John Hawkins write, White was arguably one of the government's most important post-war economists. However, due to his liberal economic policies as well as his relentless pursuit of the financial dealings of the large corporations with the Nazis, he had to be removed. So what you see going on here is that Richard Nixon is largely propped up by these Wall Street banking interests from the get-go, and there's a competing faction that has some of the same ideas, but it's like a hard and a soft way of accomplishing this. So they were going to go after Harry Dexter White for his own improprieties as a way to deflect from their dealings with Nazi Germany.
All right, I like how this is working here. Kevin, I'd like you to continue reading. Andy, when you have questions about what Kevin's reading, you go ahead and ask those questions, because that's normal that the audience would have questions, and so you can reflect their perspective. I'm getting a lot of good coverage on, the names that Kevin's mentioning that are just flying by. I've already learned about these names and have them in the brain, so that's also very convenient thus far. As far as timing, it's kind of real time. I'm showing, how to do all that stuff.
Okay.
It says death did in fact remove White on August 16th, 1948, 5 days after the Dulles-Nixon meeting on August 11th. But whereas most accounts say White died of a heart attack, like Richard Nixon and others have said this, the well-informed journalist William Edwards reported in 1949 that White's cause of death after being admitted to the hospital with a heart attack was in fact an overdose of digitalis. Summers charged that in August of 1948, as the HUAC investigation of Alger Hiss was underway, that Nixon received confirmation that Hiss had indeed known Whittaker Chambers. It came, according to CIA sources, from Allen Dulles. Dulles, who had a run-in with Hiss years earlier, was at this time in close contact with the former chief, Donovan, who was likely to be privy to whatever the OSS had learned about Hiss at the time. And Summers asked whether a secret weapon used by the Dulleses and Nixon against White and Hiss was a tendentious interpretation of material which existed about White and Hiss in the then secret Venona transcripts of deciphered Soviet cable traffic. Fascinating question still unresolved is whether Nixon's secret sources, J. Edgar Hoover, Allen Dulles, or other OSS CIA contacts, were aware by 1948 of the deciphered Venona messages and of the ALES cable, in particular on March 30th of 1945, that seemed to point to Alger Hiss's guilt. He argues suggestively that Allen Dulles may well have learned of the Venona evidence, and if as reported, he briefed Nixon on the case, then therein may perhaps lie the explanation for Nixon's confidence in the pursuit of Alger Hiss. The theory would also explain why Nixon, backed by Hoover, relied on allegations that now look extremely dubious, the most dubious of all, and yet the most persuasive at the time, being the so-called Pumpkin Papers. Next section is Alger Hiss after his conviction on perjury charges, and it starts with the coverage of the grand jury that was convened to indict Whittaker Chambers in 1948, and how Nixon sought to kind of change the public opinion on how this would be viewed after the fact. He had a personal meeting in which there are these copies of films that are placed inside of a pumpkin and later discovered 24 hours after Nixon had been there. All of this is in the article. This then gets trumpeted by the HUAC executive session proceedings as the smoking gun to get Alger Hiss, because it seems like Nixon, by this article, by what Peter Dale Scott is telling us, is that Nixon really wanted to allow Chambers to kind of go by the wayside, and Hiss was his main target the whole time, and it was for political expediency because these guys did have dirt on them, but they also had intentions that would run counter to the financial interest of the people that put them in power. So Nixon has, an allegiance to the people that allowed him to get where he was, and he just happened to be in a position where he could go after them.
Hey, I just discovered that I think there's more than one version of this Peter Dale Scott article, because the first one that I read that I think Andy was originally referring to, at some point talked about the Safari Club and Prescott Bush and stuff like that. And then I guess when I put it in the brain originally, I researched the link and found it in a different place because I was just looking through the rest of this. I'm like, this covers a lot of stuff, but it wasn't tying back into what else I remembered about it. Andy, have you noticed that difference?
There might actually even be 3 articles, just 2 versions of of this one that I have through Japan Focus, and then I think that I know there is another one that you're talking about. He goes into that guy. I'm going to get the name wrong, but he's sort of the main Middle East Khashoggi or
Yeah,
something
Adnan
like this.
Khashoggi, and
Yeah, if you go,
he's involved with Sir James Goldsmith and the Mayfair set, and yeah, he's a very interesting arms dealer of the time. Let's see, Peter Dale Scott, Safari Club. Is this what it is?
there's definitely a lot of overlap between those two,
Yeah,
and they might.
I wish I knew which one I saw first.
I think a lot of the importance of this, when cross-referenced with Carol Quigley's Tragedy and Hope, is that this Bank of International Settlements group was being used as kind of like the financial tip of the spear in order to reorganize post-war Germany, and there was a fight over how this was going to take place. But what ultimately wins out, as Quigley talks about, but he doesn't. He kind of glosses over some of the details that Scott has uncovered after the fact, is that there was so much overlap in the financial interest that they had reasons for doing this that were very much in line with trying to create an international monetary fund or a World Bank to draw in all of the financial capital under one system that would be controlled by an NGO, essentially a non-governmental organization. And if people at home are listening or watching and they're thinking, well, why does this Bank of International Settlements have anything to do with me? Well, because we were all sold on the idea that this is a representative government, right? Where each of us has a responsibility to be knowledgeable of these facts and to see how they relate to us. Now, I wasn't alive at the time, but I can bet that my grandparents were not given a vote on whether or not they wanted to cede financial sovereignty over to a Bank of International Settlements, nor to financially back Hitler when it's convenient, and all of these other things. So, aside from the atrocities of allowing these entities to be built over time, and then finance Hitler, and then turn on him when it became politically expedient to do so. This is very much against the interest of individuals and against the interest of all of us. I mean, they were not given. There was nothing at the time. There was no vote amongst the people. Do we want to cede our financial interest to the Bank of International Settlements, or do we want to allow these cartels to essentially run Wall Street while the rest of the country sleeps and consumes?
They live while you sleep. That's the reference. I got it. Okay, so this again, the Peter Dale Scott article is very long and detailed, but I just wanted to give some short example, demonstration, real time. So it's like I'll be doing this if I'm listening to a radio broadcast or something like that, and someone's talking about something, because I'm seeking to understand that which is being talked about. And no matter what my understanding is on any given day, I always find, strangely, I can improve that. I can improve it. I can get a little bit better detail. And I just primarily prioritize it around what's relevant. If I'm pursuing a line of inquiry about the Cold War and trying to figure out the spy rings, then you find the information that's relevant to that. You find the books and the authors who have gathered a lot of these sources, so you can go to their end notes and their bibliographies and their indices, and find your way forward in a lot more expedient fashion than like searching around randomly in the dark.
Yeah, absolutely. And with regard to what you were mentioning earlier, and finding in some of the other articles that tie into the Peter Dale Scott, is actually discussed in footnote 5 of this Japan Focus article, where it says that some in Washington wish to indict other Wall Street figures for wartime collaboration with Nazi Germany. Among those investigated were Herbert Walker and his son-in-law, Prescott Bush, father of George H.W. Bush, of course, grandfather of George W. Bush, for their role in representing the American interest of Fritz Thyssen, the German mogul who financed Hitler with the Union banking cartel, etc. According to John Loftus, Alan Dulles may have also been involved, and there's a quote from him that says, if the investigators realize that the U.S. intelligence chief in in post-war Germany, Alan Dulles was also Rotterdam's bank lawyer. They might have asked some very interesting questions. They did not know that Thyssen and Dulles were joint clients as well at the time, nor did they realize that it was Alan Dulles's other client, Baron von Kurt Schroeder, who was the Nazi trustee for Fritz Thyssen's companies, which are now claimed and owned by the Dutch. The Rotterdam Bank was at the heart of Dulles's cloaking scheme, which guarded its secrets jealously. And that's from John Loftus, How the Bush Family Made Its Fortune from the Nazis. So, I mean, there's been a lot of these, connections that have been, discussed over the years, but it's starting to make a larger picture when you see that these international banking interests are very much, they're over national sovereignty. And they decided a long time ago, I mean, as early as early 1900s, after the death of Cecil Rhodes, that they wanted to create a Pan-Anglian or Pan-Anglican union, much an English-speaking union. This is just another effort down that line to join the banking aspect and move forward with how they would create a larger United Nations. And you see this fail with the League of Nations and these lesser entities, NATO and others. But, none of this is investigated. I think we got maybe 3 articles during the whole Bush presidency that his grandfather was involved in the financing of Hitler, and all of those were, either UK or European outlets, and that was really never discussed in American media at all. And so, you would think that in a country that prides itself as having freedom and actual representation, that we might know ahead of time that the guy that you're voting for, his grandfather, financed the Nazis and was held to task on that in front of the McCormick-Dickstein committee and had his assets seized for, 55% of Nazi Germany's steel going through the ThyssenKrupp company. All of these things, these are all relevant to our daily lives. I mean, I can't tell you, how important that would have been. Well, of course, then they can just steal elections, but they can't do that as much when the public opinion and the public knowledge is such to where it can be combated, so they keep people in the dark about this. And, it's very, very important.
Could I interject there?
Absolutely.
What you just said there about, the current state of things, doesn't even come up. I mean, here it is. It actually happened as Richie said, I think John Taylor Gatto said, hiding in plain sight. It reminds me of, there was this guy just recently who, I can't remember where I saw it, but he was just, a random guy, independent journalist, basically a guy with a camera, and he shows up, I think this was in Texas, where the latest Bush is. I think he actually got elected to some, they pick an easy spot to get their foot in the door. It was that kind of thing, and it was, everyone's
road commissioner.
What was it? Yeah. Okay. You know what I'm talking about. And did you see where he confronts him and he says, he's very nervous. I mean, geez, wouldn't you be? And he says something like, there's a lot of, crime basically is what he's implying associated with the Bush name. Do you have anything to say with that? And this, piece of shit just looks at him and says, I'd have to see some sort of claim for that evidence. And it's just, I guess there's the fact that he can actually get away with that is the real problem. Him being a complete asshole, how do you do that is another thing that can't be helped. But there you go. I mean, the same stuff. It's like, I don't know. It's like an infection that, it's just, Jesus, if we don't ever get down to the root of this thing and solve it, it's gotten to this point now where that guy can just say one thing and it's completely shined off, and that's it. Now we got to live with other. Go ahead.
No, that's a great point. That's George P. Bush, right? It's like the latest incantation of George Bush, and I believe he's I think he's the son of Jeb and his wife. Is that correct? Yeah, and I believe he has some Hispanic heritage, and if you look at the current political denominational, if you look at the statistics, the Republican Party has basically came out and said that unless we appeal to the Hispanic base, we're never going to get elected again. And the Democrats have said, yeah, that's totally true. because that's where we are today with that. So they go down to Texas, much like George W. Bush was not a native Texan at all. He goes down there and basically starts oil companies, just like his dad was running oil companies for the Cuban Missile Crisis and Zapata Oil and all these different things. So it's much the same strategy. He moves from Florida, where he's from, moves to Texas, and becomes road commissioner. I think they spent, don't quote me on it, but it's like $2.5 million or something to become road commissioner. And the other guy was just handily defeated. There was no, it wasn't a big deal. But this is how they get their foot in the door, So we should look for him now to start buying baseball clubs and then selling them to the St. Louis Cardinals and profiting off of Osama bin Laden's step nephews or whoever. It's a pattern. And so with him to be able to say something like, "Oh, I'd have to see that evidence," that's like the quote that Alan Dulles gets attributed with. Whether or not he said it, it holds, that Americans don't read. So all like an acceptable answer in today's journalism, even though this wasn't like a mainstream journalist, this is like a kind of a We Are Change type confrontation. And I would have been nervous too, but I would have also brought the papers and been like, "Hey, right here, you want to sign this for me?" But Americans don't read, and he's able to just say, "Well, I'd like to see that evidence," and then people watch it and they're like, "Well, I'd like to see that evidence too," and then they go shopping and they don't go look at that evidence, because these are all relevant points. Now, sure, we can have a conversation if he wants to be a rational human being and say, "Hey, as the great grandson of somebody who did some things that were egregious, I don't agree with that, but look at my record," and he can at least try to distance himself from it, by at least acknowledging the reality of the fact. Because we can go to the paperwork, go to the Congress, look up McCormick Dickstein, this is all documented stuff. But we live in a world today where irrationality and empty answers are answers. It's like there's no integrity needed, no integrity inside, like at all. And so, for him to be able to say, "Oh, I'd like to see some evidence of that," or "I need to see the paperwork to comment," these are just like, this is the political reality that passes as actual governmental, responsibility. It's egregious. So I think that's a fantastic point, and I would urge anybody to go Google George P. Bush, land commissioner, road commissioner, whatever he is, lowest man on the totem pole in Texas until he can get more financial backing. And of course we're facing, this country's facing another Clinton Bush election coming up, most likely. So it's glaring in the face that we have oligarchical control, and people are just like, well, these are the people best suited to rule us, so why not?
I just thought of maybe one other thing that would be worth adding to this was the way I pulled up, and I don't know how you guys, whether it was already an existing fact that you had this thing about Jay Schroeder. And, I had never really heard of him until I think it must have been a Dave Emery thing, had cited him as, one of these main players. And incidentally, or maybe that inspired me to go look for some, the mythological list of the main central bankers. Well, so I just throw that in a Google search, and I found, I'll find it, if we want to post it with this or whatever. And it was sort of like those, in the movies, you see the FBI will have their like hierarchy of the gangster list, where you have, Tony Soprano at the top, and then you got the captains and all that. Same kind of structure on the central banking system. And I don't really have a quick way to verify what it was. It was something out of the 70s. But bam, there's Jay Schroeder. There's Sullivan Cromwell. I can't remember if Dulles was even cited on this thing, but
yeah, Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler by Anthony Sutton also touches on some of these ideas, and that's where I first heard of J. Anthony Schroeder. In this banking cartel that was used to facilitate the amalgamation of the Bank of International Settlements. Yeah, I think that's a very important point. And then, as I read earlier, to see that Lionel Curtis was also involved in appointing the people that were in charge of the Schrader Bank. They couldn't run from it fast enough after it was discovered that the Milner Group and the Rhodes Roundtable Group had appeased Hitler. And it was mainly Lord Lothian. And then Lionel Curtis, says, "Oh, it wasn't me; it was Lord Lothian." And they put the blame on him. There's a book that I can't remember the exact title of, but the first part of it is Appeasement, and it's by A.L. Rouse, who is a fellow at All Souls College alongside Lionel Curtis. When Frank Adeilette comes over there, Lord Lothian, Lord Halifax, and he wrote this, I think, in the 1960s, which details how the Rhodes Milner Roundtable Group was involved in the appeasing of Hitler up to and including ceding certain European territories to Hitler when it was in their advantage. Like, "Oh, we'll let you take that," and "Oh, you went too far," and then they arbitrarily draw the line based on what the public opinion polls were showing and what was coming out to the public. So I think that we're starting to see how this all comes together on the international level.
It kind of goes back to the point you made a minute ago. Is my microphone on there? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, you're good.
The point you mentioned, the public doesn't read. I mean, it gets to the point where you don't even need to read to look at some of this and just go, well, you closed one door and then a door opened over here. Basically it's just the monster laundering outfit for black operations, kind of moving the focus of things, say maybe from Europe to the Middle East. I'm just kind of pulling that. That's a generalization that I would make on it. But at the same time, you've got Poppy Bush. Kind of, this is the point where Russ Baker talks about, Poppy is traveling. He's traveling all the time. Well, why is this man who supposedly just runs this pretty small, relatively small oil company traveling just constantly? Well, I mean, I don't have the evidence in front of me to put those two pieces together, but what I can do is say, 1971, this major laundering setup closes. 1972, another major laundering setup opens.
Yeah, and so you have one that's with the Schrader Bank. So you have a German bank, and once this whole plot is discovered, and everybody's scrambling to get their money out of the Bank of International Settlements, they kind of use that same model in setting up the BCCI, which of course you mentioned has been shown to have been involved in the money laundering of the Bush family, as well as how this country has gone to war since its creation. And when you start looking into, the parallels between, you have the Schrader Bank, and that's under BIS, the Bank of International Settlements. Then the main player in the BCCI scandal was the Deutsche Bank, and the Deutsche Bank has branches in the United States, which are co-ran by Alex Brown and Sons. Deutsche Bank, Alex Brown. This is where it ties into Bankers Trust and Brown and Shipley and the people like Mayo Shattuck. Who was in charge of A.B. Brown, where A.B. Buzzy Kromgaard was the head of this organization when the 9/11 attacks took place. Mayo Shattuck resigns at September 12, 2001. The point I'm trying to make here is that these are, it's an organizational plan. They had the Bank of International Settlements. They had a good run with that. They were able to hide some Nazi gold. They were able to consolidate the financial interest of the Bank of England, the United States, and Germany for the purposes of then rebuilding Germany after it's destroyed. Because we got to remember that there's a larger war going on here, and a competition between the British Empire and the potential for a rising German Empire. And so, it was kind of like, we'll let you in on a plan that will ultimately lead to your destruction. So I thought those points you made, I had not seen the parallel in the dates related to the Bank of International Settlements and the BCCI. So I'm looking at some of the notes that you had sent over, and that was one thing that really stood out on how they were able to, fund some of those black operations. And you also found a connection there, I guess, to the Safari Club, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just kind of again, I'm not sure quite where I put those two together, but it's just kind of one of those things where you see a number of, it's just like I said, the one door opens, the other closes, everything moves over here. If we were to reference, I don't know if you got it, Rich, or if you can hear this, but I sent over that other article that I think you were talking about via Tragedy and Hope chat.
Oh, right on. Let me just go there.
It's called The State, the Deep State, and the Wall Street Overworld.
Exactly. All right. Now, let me get back to business on this. So I'm going to connect that to this other article. And I'm also going to put it under Peter Dale Scott. All right. So, state. All right. And this is where it connects to the Safari Club. Now, let's see.
While Rich is doing that, Kev, I just wanted to say, in regards to these connections, and it kind of from like people say the expression a 30,000 foot view, you sort of take an overview of these things, especially with, a guy like you that has an amazing amount of details at several points along the timeline. I mean, tell me if you would agree with this. Do you kind of see that not only is it generally a lot of the same people, a lot of it is just very, very much just, well, this scam worked here and we got away with it. Why don't does it seem to you like it sort of lacks imagination? And you see them running the same. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a lot of trial and error. Like they had goals, and there were different ways of achieving this. And a lot of this is discussed in the one of the recent Peace Revolution episodes, where it discusses the strategy of tension. This has been later applied to Operation Gladio and things like that. But it's very much just sowing these contrary dichotomies, on an international scale, because what they're after is sowing interdependence amongst nations. So what they want to do is they want to create these NGOs and these, which are non-governmental organizations, and these other roundtable bodies that operate outside of the representative structure of government. And once that reaches a crescendo, we're done. We can talk all about democracy and we're represented and all this stuff, but that only works to the extent that you're playing into the game. Okay, well, I'm voting for her because she's on my team and I want to break the glass ceiling and all these things that don't have to do with anything in reality, as far as, these aren't the reasons why you vote for somebody in order to reach a milestone. You theoretically would vote for somebody to represent you, if that's even possible in this day and age, in our current system, because they have ideas that you feel are going to be best for the country, not because they spew some empty rhetoric and then we allow them to then go off and do whatever they do for 4 years while we go to the mall and go to the store and go do whatever else we do. When I say we, I mean the general public and the consuming masses who as evident by our own voting numbers and in this country aren't participating. Now John Judge, who recently passed away, raises an excellent point in a 1980s video that I posted recently, where he talks about how in the time of Thomas Jefferson, when they're all talking about representative government, it was representative because my wagon's broke and I can't get there, and this guy's got a better wagon and he can actually get there. It was practical, So here we are today, all these years later, with, I can Skype to China if I want to. We need to step up and either decide if we're going to try to rectify and find out if we can be in a representative system, or preferably just grow up and outgrow the need for a daddy, a nanny, or whatever you want to call it in the first place. But I think that was a really excellent point that I thought he made, because we're way past that. The population numbers at that time compared to now, it's ridiculous. So how then do you fill that void? If you're a politician who recognizes that, and believe me, they all do, because they all say the same thing at the same podium at the same time. It's just empty rhetoric, and then that works, and people go on with it. But they realize that. So to fill the void in a situation where, yes, it was a representative government, because like I didn't have a car and I can't get there, and this guy's got more money and he can get there and I can't. So let's put some faith in this guy, because we know him. Not only do we know him, like maybe my daughter's married to his daughter or something, because this is a small area. We're talking about population is so much smaller. So when you get to that larger point, this is the key. The Rhodes Roundtable Group and all these people. I have R.G. Casey, who's a propaganda minister in Australia, who's working for the Roundtable coming into the United States, and they all say it's public opinion polls. That's how you run the people. You fill the void of representation with public opinion polls. And we have this through Bernays, we have it through Frank Lutz, we have it through pick one, and this is how you just show the whatever issue it is on TV. You put up a poll and you say, these people support this action and these people support this action, and there's no third choice. So it's either, okay, then it falls into categories. It's like, oh, okay, well, if I look at what Quigley says, he says that they didn't really care if it was Democratic or Republican, because you'd really just have a couple wedge issues that divide them anyway, and then you can just go on doing whatever you want to do. And it doesn't even matter. You might get one or two people in the Congress that are like, this is awful, we got to change stuff, no war, and they just redistrict them out of existence. So that's the main point I was trying to make there, is that public opinion polling fills the void where representation is no longer valid, because it's not valid. We can have the conversation about whether you could represent me. I mean, if you haven't known me my whole life and know where I'm coming from, then you're going to have to sit with me for a long time before I can convince myself that you're going to represent me the way I want, So the best way to manipulate people is then to create arbitrary divisions, class divisions, whatever you want to call it, or party divisions or affiliations, and then use public opinion polls in order to drive the system. And that's what they're still doing today. 90% of people don't support whatever some NBA owner said about something, so let's do whatever. And that's how it's working. And I think the tool that's being shown today in the personal brain, that's immensely helpful, because as you said, you bump up against a name, and then a few minutes later, it's like, oh, well, I've got him over here doing this, so that's got to be connected. And so I took the Anglo-American Establishment by Carroll Quigley, in which he shows the circle of initiates, the outer ring, the inner ring, and how this whole society worked according to his research in his 2 years in the Council on Foreign Relations archive, and I put that in my brain file. And in doing that, I mean, there were some people I put in there and I didn't even link to anything because I didn't know who they were. But as I've gone on and as I've read books, there they are. They're, it's all filling out. So in order to, establish, the logic of the situation, you need to look into it a little bit and figure out who the main players are and how this took place. So I see that every day. Like, I'll be going through a book that I just got, and it's like, okay, well, I'm not familiar with this person, and I put him in my brain, and wow, I've already entered that guy's name a long time ago because he was part of this database that Quigley helped me out with here in his book, and now I see how he was the head of the Bank of International Settlements doing this, and over here he's part of the Yale Institute of Human Relations, and you start looking into that, and it's like, wow, they were using, a multifold strategy across generations in order to harness the power of government and the power of supposed representative government. And this gets into a larger issue in how the British Empire and the Commonwealth, as it changed, recognized the American system and the way that it could be changed just a little bit in order to become the best model possible for a universal system. So, like this positive negative rights dichotomy on what government actually means, you just change a few words and a few things over time, and we're all subjects again. So, I think that's an excellent point.
I agree. Yeah, it's almost like they say, if there's an asteroid coming at the Earth or any kind of projectile on a trajectory, you don't necessarily need to move that thing off, a mile. You can just tap it at just the right pressure to place it again exactly where you want. And it seems like so far pretty successful, but
Well, I'd say if I was watching this video and I'd never seen any of this before, it might be a little bit overwhelming. But once you start to cogitate on what's going on and you connect the actions with the mouse and what's going on in the screen, I think it gives you a level of understanding of the history blueprint in action, how it's practically applying to every bit of research that I do, and Kevin and Andy's just learning. But it starts with the questions. It starts with the ability to do a couple keystrokes into your favorite search engine, as you've seen on screen, and following it from there, and then just trying to organize it not only in your mind, but the modeling of that information helps you to visualize it and see, oh, is this somebody who influenced this person, or were they influenced by this person adjacently? You could just it's open for interpretation. It's creative and unique for each person who wants to start either looking or actively modeling. Either way, it's useful. I find it useful as a reference tool just as much as I find it useful as building knowledge for the future. So it has two edges. Both of them are useful. Neither of them are really sharp enough to cut you. So it's not dangerous.
Yeah, and that's a great point, and we can discuss it on many levels. There are definitely aspects of all of this research where it's conspiratorial, and then there's a whole other side of this where it really doesn't matter if it's conspiratorial, if it's the reality that we're living in. So whether or not each individual person, somebody might have had benevolent intentions, somebody might have been, the opposite. So what we're dealing with is really trying to explain how we got to where we are today, and how these institutions were able to grow up outside of our idealized form of what we're told this government is supposed to be. Because I've always said that I feel like we're never going to get to a point where people realize that we probably don't need government anymore. In the aspect in the way that it is today, especially, we're not going to get there unless we go back and understand how we got to this point. And one thing that I think relates, I kind of mentioned it a minute ago. I have a letter from R.G. Casey, who I said was the propaganda minister for the Rhodes Roundtable Group, who Lionel Curtis and others put into power in Australia and then sent to the United States to be a proxy for the Rhodes Milner Group. He sent a letter here to the Prime Minister on May 2nd, 1929, which I pulled off of the Australian government's official website. And I think you'll find the parallel fascinating. He talks about this gathering that took place, which was to give Lionel Curtis an opportunity on speaking on the part played by the Royal Institute of International Affairs and how he made such a good story of it. He showed how big business interests could work in the Institute to their mutual benefit. He said how impressed he had been in these years since the war at the degree to which the city, by its manifold foreign relations, was instrumental in influencing international affairs, and in the volume and quality of the information that could add to the common fund of information on foreign affairs. He pleaded for greater use made by the Royal Institute of International Affairs by the city, and both as a bank into which they could deposit specific information and a common fund on which they could draw as required. Most of the big banks and businesses and institutions maintained one or more men specifically to keep in touch with foreign affairs, either generally or in respect to particular countries with which they do business. And these men were coming to regard the Royal Institute of International Affairs as a most useful source. The Foreign Office itself was under the disability that it could not maintain relations, either as regards to receiving or giving information with private individuals or firms. But the Royal Institute of International Affairs has no such disability. So what it's basically saying is there that the Royal Institute of International Affairs offers the non-governmental authority for the things that they can't get accomplished even in England at the time because of their own laws and their own way of dealing with these issues. So the British Foreign Office couldn't come out and say, "Oh, I'll support this institute and we'll support the policies that it puts out." What it could do is allow the people that are running the Foreign Office to become members of this outside bank that holds information that they treat much like a bank. So this is from 1929, and this is the propaganda minister that then comes over to the United States, picks up a secretary to follow him around who's a Rhodes Scholar, and then goes on to influence American foreign policy in the war. I'll send this over to Rich, so it'll be included in the notes as well. But the banking analogy definitely follows. It's the same concept. It's let's set up this third-party organization that has nothing to do with the actual governmental structure as the first step towards a international organic unity or a international polity, if you will.
No, I was just on mute because I was clicking as you guys were going through. And did you guys send me a link?
I just sent you the RGKC link. It's got the information I just read on the Royal Institute. It also discusses Lord Balfour, so it's worth reading straight through. Deals with how they influenced Kellogg in London, etc. But RGKC, he was one of the founders of or one of the founding members or chairman of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. So you had the Royal Institute of International Affairs, you had the Council on Foreign Relations, you had the Institute of Pacific Relations, and then you have other roundtable groups that operate inside of each of those countries to manage the cities. So they set up what were called foreign policy associations across the United States. They also did this in Canada. They had a Toronto Institute of International Affairs. But R.G. Casey himself, what's interesting is he was the first Australian minister to come to Washington from Australia in 1940. And he was a definite member of the Rhodes-Milner Roundtable Group beginning from 1909. And I have a source that can be referenced here as the Institute of Commonwealth Studies, which discusses Casey and the Americans and war propaganda in the United States in 1940 and 1941. It was his paraphrasing what his main goal was when he came to the United States was he was chanting the mantra, repeating the mantra that it's not just Britain's war, it's your war. And he was long suspected by people in the United States as being a secret agent for Britain, but this was never borne out in any other way other than to draw the United States away from isolationism, which to that point had been what was being pushed in foreign policy. Most people were so upset with World
Thomas
War I.
Jefferson was isolationism. Right. The isolationism is a negative connotation on a policy of not screwing with the foreign policy of other countries, and just basically saying, hey, we can guard our coasts and we've got enough to be self-sufficient, so let's not entangle ourselves in foreign affairs, and we would have been happily ever after until the special relationship comes in and says, hey, cousins, we killed off our other cousins that we were playing with in Germany and Russia, and how would you guys like to play with us and give us access to all your sensitive data and weaponry and, lend lease and take over our bases? And we're, so like Adam Curtis's The Mayfair set talks about how the empire was in receivership and how they were trying to come up with a new way to support the empire. And they said, hey, since we don't have any industry anymore, let's just sell arms to all these different countries. And then the United States is like, hey, close behind them, right there with you. And then you have the strategy of tension that kicks off the Cold War and everything you see today with Operation Gladio B and the Islamic terrorists who are funded by the same people who funded the Nazis, right? So there's a historical record that shows the funding of alleged enemies in order to create the strategy of tension, which is an artificial scarcity based on them saying these guys are the bad guys, we got to go get them, and we need all powers. Forget the Constitution, we got the Patriot Act because we got to make America safe. Instead of saying America's made of individuals, we need to secure the rights of these individuals. That's the best thing a government can do. And if we're not going to have the best thing, let's not have anything. But if we can't have anything, you have to be autonomous. And that involves little extra reading, and all of us raising our consciousness level through taking on activities and spending a little time doing something like what we've done here for the past hour, almost and a half. And by clicking into the online version of the History Blueprint, you can follow along with what you see in the video, dig deeper, read all those pages, or you can certainly purchase a copy of the History Blueprint. It's very much appreciated, and it's a gift that keeps on giving as long as you create a habit of starting to, find your way through by actually observing that which exists and trying to connect it together into an understanding before assuming a position, like politically, on something, or taking actions in the real world that affect other people's freedom and liberty. So, on behalf of this Tragedy and Hope Casual Cafe research session crew, I would like to thank anyone who has waded their way through, the mixed quality of audio and the sometimes, static nature of the screen capture. But if you're actually actively participating and watching and listening, I think you can discover a lot of meaningful and substantial habits, traits, tips, tactics, methods that have been revealed visually while these two gentlemen were so kindly reviewing that illustrious article by Peter Dale Scott. So until next time, I'm your host and navigator, Richard Grove, and on behalf of Kevin Cole and Andy Edwards of the Tragedy and Hope Research community, we bid you farewell.